The low rumble of the truck's engine was the only sound Caleb Rourke had paid attention to for the last 6 hours. He stood at the edge of the overlook, leaning against the cold steel of the guardrail, and stared out at the expanse of Lake Superior. Michigan's Upper Peninsula stretched out before him, a sleeping giant draped in a cloak of birch and pine that drank the autumn haze. The air was sharp with the scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke, a smell that was supposed to bring peace. For Cal, it just felt empty. Too empty. Caleb Rourke was in his mid-30s, built with the hard, practical muscle of a man whose life was lived in the extremes. He was a Navy SEAL on mandatory leave, and his face was etched with the fine lines of someone who had seen too much and spoken too little. He was here to decompress, to shed the weight of his last deployment, but the profound silence of the North Woods felt more deafening than the screaming engines and rotor wash he was used to. At his feet sat Rune, a magnificent German shepherd. Rune was not a pet. He was Cal's partner, a K9 handler's other half, trained for the same brutal environments. The dog's intelligent eyes missed nothing, his black and tan coat thick against the coming cold. He sat with a disciplined stillness, attuned only to the man beside him. The drive from the small town plunged them deep into the peninsula's forested heart. The hunting lodge was old, built from dark timber and tucked into a grove of hemlock so dense it felt like twilight even at noon. It was isolated, which was exactly what Cal had needed. He dropped his duffel bag on the pine floorboards. The air inside was cold, carrying the scent of old wood and the ashes of a long-dead fire. Rune performed a quick, professional sweep of the small structure, a main room, a kitchen, 2 small bedrooms, and a deep porch, before settling by the door. His duty was done. Cal stared out the window. The quiet pressed in, demanding his attention, forcing his mind back to places he desperately needed to escape. In the teams, silence was vigilance. It was listening for the scrape of a boot, the click of a rifle's safety. Here, the silence was a void, and his mind rushed to fill it with ghosts. The next morning, the fog was thicker, clinging to the ground like a shroud. Cal needed routine. He needed the familiar rhythm of work to quiet the noise in his head. Rune, sentry, he commanded, his voice low. The dog rose, instantly alert. They moved into the woods, a seamless partnership. Cal used hand signals, his movements economical, precise. Rune moved like his namesake, a shadow flitting between the massive trees, checking the perimeter of their lodge, alert for anything, a deer, a fox, a threat. This was their ritual. This was control. Cal moved through the damp ferns. The only sound was the soft crunch of fallen leaves under his boots. But even that small sound was enough. Click. He froze. It was not a click from the woods. It was the click in his memory, the sound of a pressure plate, the agonizing second of silence before the blast. His last mission had been a success. Technically. They got the target, but at what cost? The weight of the choice he'd made pressed down on him. 2 paths, 2 bad outcomes. He had chosen the one he could live with, but living with it was proving harder than he expected. The faces of his men, the tension in their eyes as they waited for his call. That was the echo he heard in the Michigan silence. He shook his head, forcing the memory back into its box. He focused on the present, the scent of wet earth, the sight of Rune pausing, looking back, waiting for the next command. Home, Cal said. They returned to the lodge, the restless energy still thrumming under Cal's skin. He spent the day listlessly. He chopped what he did not need. He cleaned weapons that were already immaculate. He tried to read, but the words blurred. The quiet was relentless. As dusk fell, the weather turned. The peaceful northern mist transformed into a hostile Great Lakes storm. Wind howled through the pines, rattling the old window panes. Rain began to lash against the cabin, driven by a savage force coming off the water. Cal welcomed it. This was a noise he understood. This was the environment of his job. He lit a fire, the crackle and hiss a comfort as the cabin shuddered against the gusts. He was stirring a simple soup over the stove when Rune, who had been dozing by the hearth, suddenly lifted his head. His ears swiveled flat against his skull. Then he stood, a low growl vibrating deep in his chest. Cal stopped stirring. "What is it, bud?" Rune moved to the door, not barking, but rigid. He stared toward the small secondary path that led down to the water, toward a dilapidated private dock that belonged to the neighboring property, a property Cal knew was supposed to be empty. Cal trusted his dog's instincts implicitly. Rune did not alert for deer. He alerted for people. Cal grabbed his heavy flashlight from the mantel and pulled on his rain jacket. "With me." They stepped out into the chaos. The wind ripped the door from his hand, slamming it shut. Rain hit his face like needles. He followed Rune, the beam of the flashlight cutting a weak cone into the pitch-black woods. The path was slick mud, and the roar of the wind and crashing waves nearly drowned out all other sound. As they neared the shoreline, Cal heard it, a faint cry swallowed by the storm. He quickened his pace, Rune running just ahead. They broke through the tree line onto the small clearing that housed the dock. The dock itself was ancient, half its planks missing, tilted dangerously toward the churning black water. And there were people on it. His flashlight beam found them. 2 men, bulky shapes in dark rain gear, their faces hidden by hoods. They were struggling with a third figure, a much smaller person who was fighting weakly, trying to break free. "Hey!" Cal yelled, but his voice was stolen by the wind. Rune needed no command. He let out a single ferocious bark that cut through the storm. The 2 men froze, turning toward the light. They had been trying to drag the smaller figure toward the end of the dock, toward a small boat hidden in the shadows. Cal walked forward, his step steady on the unsteady planks. He did not run. He did not shout again. He just advanced, the beam of the flashlight steady on the taller of the 2 men, with Rune flanking him, teeth bared in a silent, terrifying snarl. The men tensed, ready for a fight. They were opportunistic predators, relying on the storm and the isolation. They were not prepared for Cal. He stopped just feet away. The figure they held was a woman, he realized. Ella, though he did not know her name, was small, drowning in a dark hoodie, her face completely obscured. She was trembling, clearly terrified, but had gone suddenly still. "Let her go," Cal said. His voice was not loud, but it carried the absolute certainty of command. One of the men postured. "Mind your own business. This ain't your concern." Cal ignored him. He looked directly at the woman. He took the final step, placing himself between her and the men. He reached out and put a solid, protective hand on her shoulder. She flinched but did not pull away. Cal looked back at the 2 men. The flashlight illuminated the cold calm in his eyes. "She's with me." It was not the words that stopped them. It was the presence. It was the absolute lack of fear from the man standing alone in the storm. It was the way he stood, balanced, ready, his stillness more threatening than any shout. They saw the shepherd at his side, a trained animal waiting for a single word. They saw the man, and they understood he was not a victim. He was something else entirely. The taller man hesitated, recalculating the odds. He glanced at his partner. This was not the easy grab they had planned. "Forget it," the man muttered, shoving the woman toward Cal. "She ain't worth this." They scrambled back, clumsy in their haste, disappearing into the woods the way they came. The dock was suddenly empty, save for the 3 of them. The wind howled. The woman, Ella, slumped against a rotting piling, her breath coming in ragged, silent gasps. She was shaking so violently Cal could feel it through his hand. He kept his hand firmly on her shoulder, a solid anchor in the storm. "You're safe," he said, pitching his voice to be heard over the wind. "They're gone." She did not look up. She did not speak. She just trembled in the dark, her face hidden, completely lost in the center of the storm. The wind tried to tear her from his grip. Cal kept his hand locked on her shoulder, a solid point of pressure guiding her through the thrashing trees. The walk back to the lodge was short, but it felt like miles. Ella, the woman whose name he did not know, was a ghost in his grasp, moving only because he propelled her forward. She was light, soaked to the bone, and trembling so hard he could feel the vibrations through his arm. He kicked the lodge door open, and a rush of warm, firelit air spilled out into the storm. He guided her inside and shut the door, the latch clicking shut with a sound of finality. The roar of the storm was instantly muted, replaced by the crackle of the fire and the drumming of rain on the roof. The sudden warmth and light seemed to hurt her. She flinched, pulling the hood of her sodden sweatshirt down further, a desperate, reflexive gesture to cover herself. She didn't look at him. She didn't look at the fire. She immediately found the darkest corner of the room, between a bookshelf and the cold chimney stack, and slid down the wall until she was huddled on the floor, knees drawn to her chest. She was a bundle of wet fabric and silent terror. Cal stood by the door, dripping onto the floor mat. His training was screaming at him. Secure the asset. Assess the threat. Get intel. Who were they? Why were they after her? Is she a victim or bait? He was a man of action, a man who solved problems by confronting them. But the woman in the corner was not a problem to be solved. She was a person who was broken. He saw it instantly. This was not defiance. It was shock, deep and absolute. He forced himself to exhale. He unclipped Rune's leash, and the dog immediately shook off the rein, spraying water everywhere. "Easy, bud," Cal said, his voice deliberately calm. He turned his back to the woman, a calculated move to show he was not a threat. He hung his wet jacket by the door. He toweled off his hair, then grabbed a clean, dry towel from the small bathroom. He walked slowly, not directly at her, but toward the fireplace. He tossed another log onto the fire, sending a cascade of sparks up the chimney. Then he approached her corner. He didn't speak. He just laid the dry towel on the floor a few feet away from her. She didn't move. Her head was bowed, the hood hiding her face completely. He went to his duffel bag and pulled out a thick gray wool blanket. He set that down next to the towel. Still no response. He returned to the small kitchen area. The soup he had been making was still simmering. He ladled a steaming portion into a heavy ceramic mug, then poured a glass of water. He placed both items on the floor just outside her immediate space, close enough to reach, far enough not to be an invasion. She recoiled slightly, pressing herself harder against the wall. "You need to get warm," Cal said, his voice quiet, matter of fact. "Eat. Drink. No one is coming back here tonight." He left her alone. He got his own mug of soup and sat in the heavy wooden chair across the room near the window, placing himself between her and the only two ways in, the door and the main window. He ate slowly. Rune, after a long drink from his bowl, patted over and lay down, not by Cal, but in the center of the room, positioning himself as a silent guardian for everyone. He let out a deep, contented sigh and rested his head on his paws, his eyes on the door. Cal watched the woman. He could see his own reflection in the dark window and hers, a small dark shape in the corner. He recognized this kind of trauma. He'd seen it in refugees, in hostages. The body was present, but the mind was far away, hiding somewhere safe. His urge to command, to order her to eat, was strong. It was how he kept his team alive. But here, he knew command would only break her further. So he waited. It was the hardest thing he could do. An hour passed. The fire crackled. The storm raged. The only movement was Cal getting up once to add wood to the fire. The woman had not moved. The soup sat untouched, a skin forming on its cooling surface. Then Rune moved. The shepherd lifted his head, gave a small whine, and stood. He walked over to the woman's corner, his claws clicking softly on the wood floor. He didn't nudge her. He didn't lick her hand. He simply lay down beside her, close enough for her to touch, and placed his head on the floor facing the door. He was on watch. Cal watched, holding his breath. He saw her hand, pale and trembling, emerge from the sleeve of her hoodie. She hesitated, her fingers hovering in the air. Then, slowly, she lowered her hand and buried it in the thick fur on Rune's back. Her fingers clenched, grabbing handfuls of fur as if he were the only solid thing in the world. Rune didn't flinch. He just let out another low sigh. A small, choked sound came from the woman. It was the first noise she had made. It wasn't a word, just a broken gasp of air. Cal saw his opening. He stood, moving without suddenness. He went to the kettle, heated water, and brewed a cup of strong tea the way his mother used to. He added a spoonful of honey. He brought the mug over, kneeling down slowly so as not to tower over her. "I brought you some tea," he said, his voice just above a whisper. "It's warm. It will help." She didn't look up, but her hand was still buried in Rune's fur. As Cal set the mug down beside the untouched soup, her wet sleeve fell back from her wrist. He froze. In the dim firelight, he saw it clearly. It was not a fresh injury. It was a pale lattice pattern of old, healed scars. They encircled her wrist, faded but unmistakable. The marks of restraints, of being bound. His mind, trained to see patterns, connected the dots. The men on the dock, the terror, the hoodie used as a hiding place. These scars. This was not a random attack. This was part of a history. She was not just a victim. She was someone's victim. And they had come back. He felt a cold, sharp anger settle in his gut, an emotion far cleaner and more familiar than the helpless patience he'd been feeling. He showed nothing on his face. He didn't stare. He didn't ask. He reached for the wool blanket he had left for her. Gently, deliberately, he unfolded it and draped it over her shaking shoulders, tucking it in around her, his hand brushing her arm. He made sure the blanket covered her hands, her wrist, the scars. "Get some rest," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "You're safe here. I promise." He stood and went back to his chair by the door. He did not go to his bed. He picked up his rifle from its case, laying it across his lap, not as a threat, but as a tool. The lodge was secure. Rune was at her side. And he, Caleb Rourke, was on watch. Outside, the storm continued to howl, but inside the small lodge, there was a fragile truce. Hours later, through the sound of the wind, Cal heard the quiet scrape of the ceramic mug. He didn't turn, but he listened as she took a small, hesitant sip of the tea. It was a start. He watched the shadows dance on the wall, and for the first time since his mission, the silence in his own head was gone, replaced by a singular, sharp focus. He would keep her safe. The morning broke gray and bruised. The storm had exhausted itself, leaving an eerie, dripping silence in its wake, broken only by the occasional cry of a gull. Cal had not slept. He sat in the chair by the door, the rifle resting across his knees, a silent guardian. His guest had not moved from her corner. He wasn't sure if she had slept, but she was alive, her breathing shallow but steady under the wool blanket. The tea mug was empty, sitting beside the untouched bowl of soup. A small victory. Cal rose slowly, stiffly, careful not to make any sudden movements. He needed coffee, and he needed a plan. The woman was not a threat. He had determined that she was the mission, and the mission was simple: keep her safe. He moved to the kitchen. The familiar ritual of measuring coffee grounds and water was a comfort. The rich, dark scent soon filled the small lodge, a flag of normalcy in a tense situation. He poured 2 mugs, one for himself, black, and one he set on the floor near her, next to the empty tea mug. He added a splash of milk from a small carton, remembering the scars. She was fragile. "Coffee," he said, his voice low. She flinched at the sound but didn't look up. He retreated to his chair. The silence stretched, heavier than the fog outside. Cal was used to silence, but this was different. This was not the companionable silence of a team on surveillance or the respectful quiet of the deep woods. This was a heavy, suffocating blanket of trauma. He recognized it. This was not just a woman who would not speak. This was a woman who could not. Her voice was locked away, a prisoner of whatever or whoever had left those marks on her wrist. He was a man of action, and this inaction was a torment. He felt the need to fill the void, to do something. He looked at Rune. The shepherd was awake, watching the woman with a quiet, patient intelligence. "Well, Bud," Cal said, his voice a low rumble meant more for the dog than the woman. "Looks like the perimeter check is on hold. We've got company." Rune's tail thumped once on the floor. Ella, huddled in the corner, tensed. The man was speaking. He wasn't yelling, wasn't demanding anything. He was just talking. She risked a glance from under her hood. He was sitting across the room watching the rain, speaking to his dog. She watched him. He was a big man, hard, and she had seen the effortless, lethal way he moved on the dock. But now, she saw the lines of exhaustion around his eyes. She saw the way his hand rested on the dog's head, his fingers scratching gently behind the shepherd's ears. It was a gesture of profound, gentle familiarity. Cal needed to fill the air. The silence was too much, like the moments before an explosion. He needed a different noise. "You're a good listener, Rune," he murmured, sipping his coffee. "You always were." He fell quiet again, lost in thought, his gaze distant. The rain and the crackle of the fire were the only sounds. He stared at his hands, turning them over. "This rain, it's a wet cold, not a real cold. Not like the mountains." He looked at the dog. "Reminds me of that training op in the Rockies, the one that went sideways. Remember that, Bud? The whiteout." Ella, listening from her corner, felt a strange jolt. "The Rockies." The words were like a stone dropped into a frozen pond. Cal continued, his voice distant, reliving it. "We were supposed to be running high-altitude drills. Then the call came over the radio. Avalanche. A civilian hiker, lost off the main trail." He let out a dry, humorless laugh. "We were the closest asset. Went from a training scenario to a full-blown search and rescue in 30 seconds. Ella's breath caught in her throat. Her hand, hidden under the blanket, clenched into a fist. She was no longer just listening. She was there. "The weather was impossible," Cal said, his voice dropping, the memory vivid. "Wind high enough to peel your skin off. And the snow. So much snow. We were searching a debris field the size of a football stadium in a blizzard. Looking for a ghost." He paused, drinking his coffee. "I found her. Or Rune did. You got the scent, didn't you, boy?" Rune whined softly as if remembering the cold. Just a sliver of blue fabric under a drift. She was buried deep. Alive, but barely. Ella was trembling. She squeezed her eyes shut. The blue jacket, the snow filling her mouth, the crushing weight. "She was trapped," Cal continued, his voice a monotone as if reading an after-action report. "Arm pinned, going into hypothermic shock. We couldn't move her. Not right away. Had to wait for the SAR team with the heavy gear. My job was just to keep her alive, to keep her from slipping under. He stared into the fire. So, I talked. I just talked for hours. It felt stupid. I told her about you, Rune. Told her about my old truck that always broke down. Told her about how bad I wanted a real cheeseburger, not another protein bar. Anything to keep her tethered, to keep a voice in the world, even if she couldn't talk back. Ella's heart was hammering against her ribs. She remembered that. She remembered the suffocating darkness, the feeling of giving up. And then a voice, a deep, calm, steady voice that cut through the pain and the cold, anchoring her. A voice that talked about a dog and a truck and hamburgers. A voice that refused to let her die. She slowly, so slowly, lifted her head. She looked at Cal, the broad shoulders, the calm, focused eyes. The man from the dock was the man from the mountain. The realization was so profound, so overwhelming, she almost passed out. The day bled into evening. Ella remained silent, but her silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of pure terror. It was the silence of observation. She watched him. She watched him move, watched him care for his dog, watched him stand by the window, a silent protector. Exhaustion finally claimed her. The trauma of the dock, the storm, and now this impossible memory pulled her under. She fell into a fitful sleep, still huddled in her corner with Rune sleeping a few feet away. Cal remained in his chair, on watch. It happened just after midnight. A sound that ripped Cal from his light doze. A scream, not a faint cry, but a raw, guttural yell of pure terror. Dominic, no, please. Cal was on his feet and across the room in a single fluid motion. His rifle was on the floor. His hands were open, non-threatening. He skidded to his knees beside her, not touching, but present. You're safe, he said, his voice firm, breaking through the nightmare. You're here. You're in the lodge. He's not here. Ella thrashed, her arms coming up to defend herself. Her eyes were wide, blind with panic. No, no, Dominic. Don't. Hey, Cal said, pitching his voice lower, calmer. Look at me. You're safe. I've got you. Her eyes struggled to focus. She saw him, the man from the firelight, the man from the storm. But her memory, triggered by the avalanche story, supplied the other half, the voice, the protector. The terror from the nightmare receded, replaced by a convulsive, rattling sob. She stared at him, her chest heaving. This man. He had saved her twice. Her throat worked. A dry, rasping sound emerged. She had to. She had to know. Ella, she whispered. The name came out like broken glass, a word unused for so long it felt foreign. My name is Ella Hayes. Cal froze. The name meant nothing to him. But the voice, that specific broken, whispering voice, laced with trauma but unmistakably hers, he had heard it only once before in a blizzard, a faint murmur from blue lips. The girl from the mountain, the one he'd talked to for hours, the one he never thought he'd see again. The pieces clicked into place with the force of a rifle bolt. He just stared at her, the dark lodge, the dying fire, and the impossible truth hanging in the air between them. The fire popped, a sharp counterpoint to the sudden, heavy silence that filled the lodge. Cal stared at the woman, at Ella Hayes. The name echoed, meaningless. The voice, however, was a key, unlocking a memory he had sealed away, the faint, breathless whisper from a snowdrift, the girl he had kept alive with stories of his dog. It had been her all this time. He had saved her life, and the world had somehow broken her. Ella watched him, her eyes wide, still holding the terror of the nightmare but now sharpened by a new, desperate plea. She had spoken. She had given him her name. She had torn down the wall of her silence. And now she looked as if she expected the world to collapse on her for it. Her breath hitched, a dry sob, and she pulled her hood down as if to hide again, to take it all back. Wait, Cal said. His voice was rougher than he intended. He knelt, staying a respectful distance away, but his focus was absolute. Ella Hayes. The avalanche, the Rockies. That was you. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, a piece of a puzzle locking into place. She nodded, a small, jerky movement. Tears welled and spilled, tracking clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. The act of speaking, of naming herself, seemed to have broken the dam. Her story, locked away for so long, began to pour out, not in a flood, but in broken, painful fragments. He did it, she whispered, her voice rasping from disuse. She flinched as if expecting a blow for the words. Who? Cal asked, His voice low, steady. A rock for her to hold on to. Who did it, Ella? The men on the dock? No, she shook her head, her whole body trembling. Dominic. It was always Dominic. She said the name as if it were a curse, a poison she was finally spitting out. Dominic Price. Even in her terror, the name landed with a weight Cal recognized. He'd seen it in financial journals, a tech billionaire, a philanthropist, a man who bought his way onto magazine covers. My fiancé, she choked out, and the word sounded like ash. He was perfect. Everyone loved him. Ella's eyes unfocused, looking past Cal into the nightmare she had just escaped. But he liked to be in control of everything. She touched the faded scars on her wrist, an unconscious gesture. He said it was because he loved me. He locked me in so I wouldn't leave, so I would be safe. Cal felt the cold anger in his gut turn to ice. He kept his face impassive. Go on. I tried to leave, she whispered. I finally got out. I told him it was over. He smiled. He said he understood. He said we should take one last trip to the mountains too, to say goodbye like civilized people. The memory was so painful she had to stop, her breath catching. Rune, sensing her distress, nudged his head under her hand. She clung to him, grounding herself. The avalanche, Cal said, prompting gently. You said he did it. He was an expert climber, she said, her voice hollow. He checked my gear. He smiled at me. Her eyes met Cal's, and he saw the pure, undiluted horror of her realization. It wasn't an accident. I slipped, but I shouldn't have fallen. The line, my safety line, it was cut. Sabotaged. He left me. He left me to die in the snow. Cal processed this. The girl on the mountain. He had thought her a victim of nature, of bad luck, but she had been a victim of a planned, cold-blooded execution. And he, Caleb Rourke, had pulled her out. But you lived, he stated. I lived, she breathed, and it didn't sound like a victory. Your voice, you saved me. When I woke up in the hospital, he was there. Dominic. He was holding my hand, crying, the hero, the devoted fiancé who had lost me in the storm. She let out a sound that was almost a laugh, but it was broken and terrible. He was so relieved I was alive. And then he told me what I'd done. What you'd done. He told me I was confused, that the hypothermia, it had damaged my memory. He said I had been acting strangely for months, that I had tried to hurt myself on the mountain. And then the police came. Her voice dropped to a near inaudible whisper. They didn't come to ask about the accident. They came with a warrant. For what? Cal asked, though he was already piecing it together. The wealth, the power, the control. Embezzlement, she said. From his own charity. The one I ran for him. He said I stole millions. That I planned to run. He showed them bank accounts, transfers, things with my name. He had framed me. He knew I might not die on the mountain, so he had a backup plan, a different way to bury me. He made me a criminal, a fugitive. Now it all made sense. The men on the dock weren't random. They were hunters, either private security or bounty hunters sent by Price to retrieve his property. I ran, she said, the fight leaving her. She slumped against the wall, exhausted by the confession. I ran from the hospital. I had no money. He controlled everything. Everyone believed him. Why wouldn't they? He's Dominic Price. She pulled the hoodie tighter. I stopped talking. It was safer. If I didn't talk, I couldn't say the wrong thing. If I was hidden, he couldn't see me. I just wanted to disappear. The lodge was silent again, but this silence was different. It was filled. It was heavy with the truth. Cal looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the girl from the mountain, the one who had fought to live, and he saw the woman in front of him, the one who had been hunted into silence. The two images merged. He finally understood. He had saved her life, but he hadn't saved her. He had pulled her from the snow only for the monster to drag her back. He had been a bystander in her story, an accident. Not anymore. He stood up, the movement slow and deliberate. Ella flinched, her eyes widening, expecting him to turn her away, to call the police. He was, after all, a military man, a man of law. Instead, he walked to the stove, his back to her. He took down the untouched bowl of soup from the night before. He poured it into the pot and began to heat it, his movements methodical. You're hungry, he said. It wasn't a question. You need to eat. She stared at his back. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't leaving. He was heating up soup. He brought the hot bowl over and set it in front of her. Then he went and sat back in his chair by the door. He picked up the rifle and set it back on his lap. He looked at her, his gaze steady, unwavering, and for the first time, she didn't see a stranger. She saw the man from the mountain. She saw the protector. Ella Hayes, he said, testing the name. He nodded, a single sharp affirmation. I didn't recognize you. Not at first. He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping into that same low, protective rumble she remembered from the snow, the voice that had anchored her to life. But this time, I will not let him find you. It was not a comfort. It was a vow. And in that moment, Ella Hayes, fugitive, ghost, and victim, did something she had not done in years. She reached for the bowl of soup, and she ate. Cal's vow hung in the air, a solid thing in the small lodge. This time I will not let him find you. Ella looked at him, truly seeing the man who had twice been her savior. She had given him her truth, a story of calculated cruelty, and he hadn't called her a liar. He had not looked at her with pity. He had looked at her with purpose. And then he had heated her soup. That simple act of care, combined with the steel of his promise, was the first anchor she'd had in years. She ate every spoonful, a desperate, necessary act of refueling. She was no longer a ghost. She was a woman with an enemy, and impossibly, she now had an ally. The next morning, the fragile trust between them had solidified. Cal was still a man of quiet, intense energy, but his focus was no longer on his own demons. It was on her. He moved with the economy of a professional. While Ella drank the hot coffee he handed her, he went to the porch, out of earshot, and made a call on a rugged, military-grade satellite phone. He kept his back to the woods, his eyes scanning the tree line, never fully at rest. His call was short and precise. He was speaking to a contact, a man whose skills he trusted implicitly. Leo Glitch Martinez was the digital wizard of Cal's team, a man who lived in the ether of data streams and encrypted networks. He was a wiry man with restless fingers and a mind that moved faster than light. Glitch, Cal said, his voice low. I need a deep dive. Civilian target, Dominic Price. I need financials, associations, travel, everything. And I need to know who he employs for private security. Quietly. There was a pause. Glitch, like all men in their world, never asked why. He only asked how deep. Deep as it goes, Cal confirmed. This one's dark. He ended the call and came back inside. My team's intel specialist is looking into him, he said simply. He'll find whatever Price tried to bury. Ella nodded, clutching the mug. It felt good to have someone else do something, but Cal wasn't finished. He looked at her, at the way she still flinched when he moved, the way she seemed to fold into herself to take up less space. That's my part, he said. Now for yours. He set his own mug down. He made you feel weak. He made your body a prison. We're going to change that. Ella's eyes widened in alarm. What? I can't fight. This isn't about fighting, Cal said, his voice softening slightly. This is about control. It's about remembering that your body belongs to you. Stand up. Hesitantly, she stood. Good. Now, feel your feet on the floor. Plant them. You're not a leaf. You're part of the ground. Feel your center. He guided her, not by touching, but by commanding, his voice steady. He showed her a stance, balanced and ready. He showed her how to use her voice as a weapon, not a scream, but a sharp, guttural command. Then he moved to the practical. He'll send men like the ones on the dock. They're bigger. They'll grab you. They'll expect you to panic. He held out his own wrist. Grab me, hard as you can. She did, her grip surprisingly strong. Good. Now I'm going to pull. He pulled, and she instinctively pulled back. Wrong, he said. You're fighting my strength. I'll always win that. He relaxed. Grab me again. She did. Now don't pull back. Use my own force. When I pull, you push. Push into my arm. Find the joint, the weak point. He pulled. She pushed. And his arm buckled at an unnatural angle. He didn't even wince. See? You didn't fight me. You redirected me. You take back the control. They practiced it for an hour. Her movements were clumsy, then hesitant, then finally angry. A spark of righteous fire lit her eyes. When she broke his grip for the 5th time, a small, sharp gasp of triumph escaped her. She was breathing hard, but she was standing tall, not huddled. Late that afternoon, the satellite phone pinged with a secure message. Cal read it, and his face, already serious, darkened into a mask of cold fury. Glitch found him, he said. And you were right. He's not just a monster. He's a sloppy one. He's tied to illegal arms smuggling, using his charity as a front to wash the money. The men he framed you with, they're not just numbers on a page. They're real, and they're dangerous. He looked up, his gaze locking with hers. This is bigger than you. It's bigger than him. He's desperate, which makes you a threat he has to eliminate. Ella felt the blood drain from her face. This was worse than she ever imagined. So, what do we do? We stop running, Cal said. He pulled a second piece of equipment from his bag, a sleek, black, unmarked laptop. He booted it up. There was no operating system she recognized, just a simple, secure desktop. He turned it to face her. I'm a soldier, he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. I can be the shield. I can stand at that door, and I can stop anything that tries to come through it. But I can't win this war. I don't have the intelligence. He pushed the laptop closer. You do. You know his secrets. You know his systems. I can't be the weapon, Ella. Only you can. Ella stared at the dark screen. It reflected her own face, pale, haunted, her hair matted, a ghost in a machine. This was it. This was the moment. She could close the laptop, ask Cal to hide her, and spend the rest of her life looking over her shoulder. Or she could open it and walk back into the nightmare, but this time with her eyes open. She remembered Dominic's voice, a smooth, condescending whisper in her ear. You're just a girl, Ella. You're nothing without me. Her hand trembled as she reached for the trackpad. Her fingers felt like stone. But she thought of the scars on her wrist. She thought of the cold on the mountain. She thought of the men on the dock. And she thought of Cal teaching her to find her center. Her breath steadied. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach. But for the first time in years, it was joined by something else, rage. She touched the pad. The screen lit up. Cal had already opened the secure file Glitch had sent. It was a digital map of Dominic Price's hidden empire. What am I looking for? She whispered, her voice rough. Things he hid, Cal said. Things he framed you with, the real transactions. Ella's mind, sharp and clear now that the fog of terror was lifting, began to work. She wasn't just a figurehead. She had run that charity. She knew the books. She knew his passwords. He was arrogant, she said, her fingers flying across the keys. He used the same encryption protocols for everything. She navigated to a secure server she recognized. Before I ran, I knew he was watching me. I backed something up. I encrypted it. I hid it in my music files. She found the folder, a long list of classical music. She clicked on a seemingly innocent file, Beethoven's 7th, second movement. She entered a password, not a word, but a date, the day she had first met him, the beginning of the end. The file opened. It wasn't music, it was a recording. A cold, clear digital recording of a phone call. She'd accidentally recorded it, a pocket dial, on her laptop, but she had saved it when she heard his voice. It was Dominic speaking to his lawyer months before the avalanche. He was laughing. The charity account is the perfect laundry, his voice echoed in the lodge. And if Ella ever gets too curious, well, contingencies, my friend. We all need contingencies. She looked up at Cal. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. He never thought I'd live, she said, her voice shaking, but this time with power. He never thought I would talk again. Cal placed his hand on the back of her chair, a silent, solid presence. Now, he said, we make him regret both. The recording played, a chilling echo in the warm lodge. Dominic's voice, so cultured and smooth, laughing about contingencies. The sound hung in the air long after Ella hit stop. The adrenaline of her discovery faded, replaced by a cold, heavy dread. She had poked the monster. Now it was awake. Cal saw the shift, the fear returning to her eyes. He reached over and snapped the laptop shut. Good, he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. That's the weapon. Now we secure the armory. He stood and walked to the door, opening it just a crack. The air outside was still, the fog from the morning having thinned into a low, damp haze. Rune, who had been resting at Ella's feet, suddenly lifted his head, a low whine vibrating in his chest. He stood, walked to the door, and pushed his nose into the small opening, sniffing the air not with curiosity, but with a deep, professional tension. What is it, bud? Cal asked quietly. Rune didn't bark. He just backed away from the door, his eyes fixed on the tree line, his hackles rising almost imperceptibly. That was all the confirmation Cal needed. They were no longer alone. "Ella," he said, his voice calm, but all the warmth was gone, replaced by the ice of an operator on duty. "They're here. Or they're close." Ella's heart hammered against her ribs. She wanted to run to her corner, to pull the hoodie over her head, to disappear. But Cal looked at her, his gaze locking with hers. "You're not a victim," he said, echoing the lesson from their training. "You're a teammate. I need you focused." She swallowed, the fear sharp in her throat, but she nodded. What do we do?" "We prepare," he said. He moved with a frightening, beautiful economy of motion. He was no longer the patient man heating soup. He was a SEAL. "First, the lodge is a hard target, but it's a box. We don't get trapped. Bar the door. All windows locked." He handed her a heavy-duty flashlight, the kind that could throw a beam powerful enough to feel. "This has a strobe function. If I tell you light, you hit that button and you aim for the eyes. Don't think, just do. Understood?" "Yes," she whispered, her voice shaking, but she gripped the flashlight. While she secured the small lodge, Cal moved outside with Rune. He was a shadow among the trees, his eyes scanning not for people, but for disturbances. He found it near the path to the dock. A single, perfectly snapped twig, not broken by a deer, broken by a boot. He saw a faint impression in the mud, partially wiped. They were professionals. This was a recon team. They were scouting the objective before the assault. He nodded to himself. They were following a standard playbook, which meant he could tear it apart. He returned to the lodge, his movements silent. "They're pros," he told Ella, who was standing by the fireplace, her face pale but her eyes determined. "At least one team, probably 3 or 4 men. They're not the thugs from the dock. They're here to do a job. They'll wait for dark. They'll use the fog as cover." He checked his satellite phone. No signal. "They've jammed us. Standard entry." He looked at her, giving her the last, most important piece of the strategy. "They're here for you. They expect you to be terrified. They expect me to be a civilian. We are going to use that. You are not scared. You are angry. You are the bait. And I am the trap." The hours ticked by. The sun began to dip, and as if summoned by Price's malice, the fog rolled back in from the lake. It was not a gentle mist. It was a thick, gray, suffocating blanket swallowing the trees, the path, and finally the lodge itself. Visibility dropped to less than 10 feet. Ella stood at the window, her heart a cold stone in her chest. "I can't see anything," she whispered. "Good," Cal's voice came from the shadows by the door. "Neither can they. But I can." He was dressed in dark layers, his face smeared with streaks of mud from the hearth, breaking his own outline. Rune stood beside him, a coiled spring of muscle, utterly silent. "They'll come from 2 directions," Cal murmured, more to himself than to her. "One to draw fire, one to flank. They'll expect me at the door. I won't be." He opened the door a fraction of an inch. "Stay away from the windows, Ella. When it starts, get in the bathroom, in the tub. It's the safest place. Do not come out until I get you. But the light, I'll tell you. Stay low." Then silence. The only sound was the drip, drip, drip of condensation falling from the eaves. Rune tensed. He let out a breath. Not a growl, but a huff. Cal laid a hand on the dog's back. "Now," he whispered. He slipped out the door, vanishing into the fog like he was made of it. Ella's breath hitched. She was alone. She did as he said, scrambling into the small bathroom and pulling the shower curtain closed. She sat in the cold, dry tub, gripping the flashlight, her knuckles white. Outside, Cal and Rune moved. They were 2 predators in their element. Cal heard the first soft crunch of a boot on gravel. They were sloppy, relying too much on the fog. He signaled Rune with 2 fingers. Silent. The dog understood. A man in tactical gear, a professional contractor, moved toward the side of the lodge, his rifle up. This was Krebs, the team leader, a compact man with cold, calculating eyes. He signaled 2 of his men toward the front while he and his point man, Pike, circled to the back. Pike, a big man, moved to check the back window. As he passed a dense cluster of ferns, Rune exploded from the shadows. There was no bark, just the solid thud of 90 pounds of muscle hitting the man's chest, a gloved hand flying to his throat, and the gasp as Rune's jaws closed on his wrist, not tearing, but applying crushing pressure. The rifle clattered. The man fell, and Rune was on him, a silent, menacing weight. Krebs heard the scuffle and turned. "Pike," he hissed. He saw the shadow of his man on the ground and the larger shadow of the dog. He raised his rifle. Light. Cal's voice, sharp and clear, cut through the night. Inside, Ella reacted instantly. She burst from the bathroom, aimed the flashlight at the back window where she'd heard the sound, and hit the strobe. An epileptic pulse of blinding white light shattered the fog, catching Krebs full in the face. He cried out, momentarily blind, his night vision destroyed. It was all Cal needed. He moved from the cover of a massive pine, a ghost in Krebs's blurred vision. He didn't go for the weapon. He went for the man. He captured Krebs's rifle, pushing it skyward, and drove the heel of his palm into the man's solar plexus. The air left Krebs's lungs in a pained whoosh. Cal spun him, his arm locking around the man's neck in a perfect chokehold. Krebs struggled, his professional training useless against a superior force. He was unconscious in less than 10 seconds. Cal lowered him gently to the ground. "Two down," he breathed. He heard the two men at the front, alerted by the light and the noise, now rushing the door. They kicked it open. "Ella! Now!" Cal yelled, this time a roar. The men burst into an empty room. From the side window, Ella hit the strobe again, flooding the small lodge with blinding, disorienting light. The two men stumbled, yelling, their weapons useless as they fired at shadows. Cal came in through the back, low and fast. He took the first man high, disarming him and using his own momentum to send him crashing into the wall. The second man turned, blinded, and tried to aim at the sound. Cal was already there. A swift, brutal series, a block, a joint lock, and a knee strike. The man folded, groaning. It was over in 30 seconds. Silence. The lodge was a wreck. Two men were groaning on the floor. Two were outside. Ella stood in the bathroom doorway, the flashlight beam now steady, her whole body shaking. But she was standing. Cal was breathing hard, the adrenaline coursing. He moved to the door, his eyes scanning the fog-shrouded woods. "It's clear," he said. He turned to look at her. His face was a mask of mud and intensity. She looked at him, the protector, the soldier, but she also saw the man. He looked at her, not as a victim he had saved, but as the teammate who had just watched his back. She hadn't hidden. She hadn't frozen. She had used the light. "You did good," he said, his voice quiet. She gave him a shaky nod, her knuckles still white on the flashlight. They weren't safe. Not yet. But they were a team, and they had just won the first round. The adrenaline drained from the room, leaving a vacuum. The four men were secure, bound with their own tactical restraints. Ella was still shaking, the heavy flashlight feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Cal moved to the team leader, Krebs, who was groaning back to consciousness. Cal checked his gear with practiced efficiency, pulling a satellite radio from the man's vest. He clicked it on, found the jammer's frequency, and disabled it. The cabin was suddenly flooded with the faint electronic hum of the outside world. Cal toggled the radio to a secure, encrypted channel. He didn't call 911. He called his command. His voice was a low monotone, devoid of emotion, a stark contrast to the chaos he had just orchestrated. "Olympus, this is Bravo 6. I am in the Upper Peninsula, grid coordinate," he read it from his phone. "I have encountered a hostile fire team. 4 tangos secured, non-lethal. They attempted to abduct a civilian asset. Asset is secure with me. The hostiles are contractors, likely domestic. I am declaring my position compromised. Requesting immediate NCIS and JAG support." The voice on the other end was professional, asking no questions. "Bravo 6, Olympus copies all. Support is en route. ETA 60 mics." He clicked off the radio and turned to Ella. "Help is coming," he said. "Not police. My people." He saw the fresh wave of fear in her eyes. "NCIS," he clarified. "Naval Criminal Investigative Service. This isn't just about you anymore, Ella. They attacked an active duty serviceman. They're not just your problem now. They're theirs." 60 minutes later, as the first gray light of dawn began to separate the fog from the trees, a dark, official sedan crunched up the gravel path. A woman stepped out, and she moved with the same efficient, no-nonsense energy as Cal. This was Agent Dunn, a senior NCIS investigator. She was a woman in her 40s with dark hair pulled into a severe bun and a sharp, intelligent gaze that seemed to catalog everything at once. She saw Cal, gave a curt nod of professional respect. SEALs were a different breed, but she was the law. And then her eyes took in the 4 subdued men on the porch, her eyebrow raised. "You've been busy on your leave, Rourke." "They came for her," Cal said, nodding toward the lodge. Dunn looked past him, her gaze softening slightly as she saw Ella, pale and terrified, in the doorway. "Ma'am, I'm Agent Dunn. I'm here to help. Ella just nodded, clutching the door frame. They were sent by Dominic Price, Cal continued, his voice flat. This is why. He stepped aside and opened the laptop, pressing play on the audio file. Dominic's voice, cold and arrogant, filled the morning air. Dunn listened, her expression turning from professional curiosity to cold, hard focus. When the recording finished, she looked at Cal. Arms trafficking? My intel specialist found a deep connection. Price is using his charity as a front. Ella, Miss Hayes, was the contingency he needed to silence. Dunn's focus shifted instantly. This was no longer a simple assault. This was domestic terrorism, potential arms smuggling, and an attack on a federal officer. She got on her own radio. The force she unleashed was quiet but immense. Within hours, the 4 contractors were gone, transported to a secure facility. Ella was taken to a local NCIS field office with Cal and Rune at her side, not as a suspect, but as a protected witness. The investigation moved with lightning speed. Armed with Glitch's data and Ella's testimony, Dunn's team didn't just knock on Dominic's door, they took it off the hinges. They seized servers, financial records, and most importantly, they found the weak link. It wasn't a tough guy assistant. It was a relative, Nathan Price, Dominic's younger, weaker cousin. Nathan was a man in his late 20s with nervous hands and the haunted eyes of someone who had lived in a predator's shadow for too long. Dominic had made him the vice president of philanthropy, a title that meant he was the one forced to sign the fraudulent shipping manifests and fake bank transfers. Dunn and Cal found Nathan in a high-end Chicago condo, packing a bag, clearly terrified. Mr. Price, Dunn said, her voice calm. We're not here to arrest you. We're here to talk about your cousin. Nathan nearly collapsed in relief. He called, Nathan stammered. He found out his team failed. He's cleaning house. He told me to take a long vacation. He's cutting you loose, Cal said from the doorway, his voice a low rumble. Nathan flinched, seeing the large, imposing man, but Dunn held up a hand. Mr. Price, she said gently. We know about the arms. We know he framed Ella Hayes. We just need you to confirm it. Nathan looked from Dunn's steady gaze to Cal's silent, imposing form. This was his chance. Dominic's protection was gone, replaced by a threat. This was real protection. He sank onto a chair. It's all true, he whispered, the words spilling out. All of it. He's a monster. He controls everything. The avalanche, I heard him talking about it. He called it unfortunate housekeeping. He laughed. Nathan's testimony was the key. He had the bank codes. He knew the shell corporations. He knew the names of the buyers. He gave Dunn everything. He confirmed Ella's entire story, from the false charges to Dominic's obsessive, violent rages. The climax was swift. Dominic Price was in his glass-walled penthouse office, furiously yelling into the phone at his lawyer. He was untouchable, a king in his castle. He didn't even look up when his office door slid open, assuming it was his assistant. What? He snapped. Mr. Price? Agent Dunn's voice was sharp. He looked up, his eyes widening in disbelief. Dunn stood there, flanked by 2 armed federal agents. Dominic Price, she said, her voice ringing with authority. You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, violations of the Arms Export Control Act, and assault on a federal officer. Dominic's face, a mask of arrogant rage, collapsed. The king was in checkmate. Days later, Ella stood in the same NCIS office. She was not in her hoodie. She was in a simple blue dress Dunn's team had provided. Her hair was washed. She stood straight. Agent Dunn walked in, holding a single file. It's done, Dunn said, a rare, small smile on her face. With Nathan's testimony and the evidence you provided, the U.S. Attorney has officially dropped all charges against you. The case is sealed. You are officially and publicly vindicated. You are free, Miss Hayes. Ella let out a breath she felt she had been holding for 3 years. The weight didn't just lift, it evaporated. Cal stood by the door, watching, Rune at his side. Dunn looked at Ella. Your testimony will be required at trial, but you will be fully protected. Ella nodded. She turned to the agent, not with the downcast eyes of a victim, but with the steady gaze of a survivor. Thank you, Agent Dunn, she said. Her voice was not a whisper. It was not broken. It was clear, strong, and confident. What do I need to do next? The drive back to the Upper Peninsula was silent, but it was a new kind of quiet. The old, suffocating silence of fear had been replaced by the vast, open quiet of release. Ella sat in the passenger seat of Cal's truck, watching the familiar, fog-draped trees pass by. They were no longer menacing shadows, but just trees. Rune was in the back, his head resting on the center console, his soft breathing a rhythmic counterpoint to the hum of the engine. They had been cleared by Agent Dunn, their testimonies logged. Dominic Price was in federal custody, his empire crumbling as Nathan's testimony unlocked every dark secret. Ella was, for the first time in years, completely and truly free. They arrived at the lodge. It was no longer a fortress, a last stand. It was just a house. Cal unlocked the door, and the familiar scent of wood smoke and pine welcomed them. It smelled like safety, like home. Cal looked at his watch. His mandatory leave was over. He had to report back to his base in Coronado in 36 hours. The knowledge settled between them, a quiet acknowledgement that this chapter, at least, was ending. That night, Ella slept not in the corner, but in one of the small beds. Cal took the other. There was no need for a guard. Rune slept on the rug between them, a silent bridge. For the first time, Cal slept deeply, the rifle not in his lap, but secured in its case. The next morning, they woke before the sun. A soft, pearlescent light was just beginning to touch the fog. "Come on," Cal said, his voice quiet in the pre-dawn chill. "I want to show you something." He, Ella, and Rune walked down the path, past the rotten dock that had been the site of her rescue, and onto the rocky, windswept beach. The tide was out, revealing a wide expanse of dark, wet sand. Lake Superior was calm, the water like slate-gray glass. They walked along the shoreline, Rune running ahead, chasing seabirds, his barks joyful and sharp in the clean air. He was no longer a sentry. He was just a dog. Ella pulled the hood of her borrowed sweatshirt up, not to hide, but for warmth. She looked at Cal. He was staring out at the water, at the distant, dark line of the horizon. The hard operator's mask was gone. He looked tired. "You're leaving," she said, not as a question, but a statement. "Tomorrow morning," he confirmed. He picked up a flat stone and skipped it across the water, once, twice, 3 times, before it sank. "What you said," Ella began, her voice soft. Back in the lodge, that the silence was too loud. "What did you mean?" Cal stopped walking. He looked at the man-sized pieces of driftwood piled on the beach, skeletons of ancient trees. He had shared his strength with her. Now, in this new, safe quiet, his own vulnerability surfaced. "In my world," he said, his gaze distant, "silence is loud. It's the moment before. The pause before the sound. The click of a pressure plate, the intake of breath before an ambush." He finally looked at her, and she saw the soul scar he carried, the one that wasn't physical. "My last mission, the one I was on leave for, I had to make a call. A 50-50. A building with a high-value target but bad intel on civilians. Or a secondary route, safer for us, but the target might escape." He paused. "I made the call. We got the target, but the intel, it was worse than bad. It was wrong. There was collateral damage." He wasn't the hero. He was just a man living with the math. "When I'm here in the quiet, I hear it. The click. The silence before I gave the order." Ella listened. She had seen him as a protector, an immovable force. But now she saw the truth. He was a man carrying an impossible weight, the burden of choices that had no right answers. She had been saved by him, but she realized in a way they were the same, both hunted by a past that wouldn't let go. She didn't offer platitudes. She didn't say, "It wasn't your fault." She simply stepped closer and, for the first time, initiated contact. She slid her small, warm hand into his. His hand was calloused and hard, but his fingers closed around hers gently. "You're not alone in the quiet, Cal," she whispered. He looked down at their joined hands, and the rigid line of his shoulders softened. He had been her anchor in the storm. Now, she was his. They walked back to the lodge as the sun rose, the silence between them no longer empty, but full. Back inside, Cal began to pack his duffel bag, a simple, methodical process. Ella made coffee, the domestic ritual a comfort. As she turned, her eyes fell on something she had actively ignored for days. In the far corner of the main room sat an old upright piano. It was dusty, the wood faded, some of the keys chipped. It was part of the lodge, part of the history. But for her, it had been a monument to a life she thought was gone. Dominic had loved her music. He had bought her a grand piano, a beautiful, black, shining cage. He had controlled what she played, where she played, and for whom. After the avalanche, after the frame-up, she hadn't touched a key. The thought of playing, of creating beauty, had felt like a betrayal. Her music had been stolen, just like her voice. Now, she walked toward it. Cal stopped packing, watching her. She sat on the wobbly bench and lifted the wooden cover. The keys were yellowed. She touched a single note, a middle C. It was out of tune, but the sound, a hollow, lonely plunk, echoed in the room. She took a breath. Her fingers, stiff and unsure, found their place. She began to play. It was not a grand concerto. It was simple. A broken, hesitant melody. A Chopin nocturne she remembered from childhood, long before Dominic. Her fingers fumbled, found the wrong notes, then corrected. The music was rusty, like her voice had been, but as she played, the rust fell away. The melody grew stronger, more confident, filling the small lodge with a sound of profound, heartbreaking, hopeful sorrow. Cal sat on the edge of his bed, his bag forgotten. He listened. This was her. This was the voice beneath the whisper, the woman beneath the victim. This was Ella. The music spoke of her pain, her flight, her terror, but it also spoke of her strength. It spoke of the dawn they had just watched. He closed his eyes. The click in his head, the echo of the explosion, the ghosts of his mission, they didn't disappear, but the music, it soothed them. It wrapped around the sharp edges of his trauma and softened them. It gave him peace. Ella played for a long time. When the final note faded, she let her hands rest on the keys. The silence that followed was the most peaceful Cal had ever known. She turned on the bench to look at him. He didn't speak. He just nodded, his eyes full of a deep, quiet understanding that went beyond words. Her music had saved him just as his voice had saved her. She smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached her eyes. He smiled back. His leave was over. He had to go back to his world. She had to start building hers. But here, in this small lodge, surrounded by fog and the echo of old music, two survivors had finally, truly come home.